Welcome, everybody. It's an awesome opportunity that we have to be here. We're really thrilled to be with you. And also, we're going to be recording this tonight, so I have to welcome you to the Marketing Agility podcast, too. A lot of the content that we're going to be sharing with you tonight comes out of the conversations that we've had on the Marketing Agility podcast. So we're going to be reflecting on those conversations. We're going to share with you, we're going to start by sharing with you a little bit of information about what's involved with scaling agile marketing into companies as a backdrop for a conversation about the top 6 challenges that we hear from the marketers that we've talked to on the show. And then we'll close out just by sharing a little bit of our perspective as the co-hosts of the show as we reflect on what we've heard. And I hope we can have some time for some Q&A at the end, too. So without further ado, my name's Roland Smart.
And I'm Frank Days.
All right. And I want to just start by giving you a little bit of some of the reasons why you might trust some of the advice or some of the insights that we're going to share with you today. Why are we qualified to talk about agile marketing? So one reason is that actually Frank started this podcast back in 2010. He's talked with many marketers, and I have as well. We've done over 40 episodes. We've talked to many different kinds of companies. So big companies, small companies, companies that are doing B2B, B2C. We've talked with different roles within those companies, whether it's a CMO, a leader, a thought leader, a practitioner who's in the trenches. So we've heard pretty much every perspective there is to have. And today that includes not just people in companies, but also agencies that are trying to help companies, consultants that are trying to help with change management, and all the different players in the ecosystem around what we see as a transformation associated with agile marketing.
So what presentation would be complete without some data? I describe this as semi-empirical data, in that we did a review of recent podcasts and try to correlate the conversations that we had to the actual topics within the marketing field. And you'll see a lot of the folks who are trying to dabble with Agile are starting from really a project management and workflow standpoint. That is, trying to figure out a way to get either the same work done faster or more work done in the same amount of time. And if you look down the list, you see, you can see across the board. The interesting thing also, as Roland mentioned, we started the podcast back in 2010. And back then, Agile marketing was something that was kind of a quirk. It was kind of a funny thing. I mean, the gentleman I was doing the podcast with, John Cass, runs the Agile Marketing Meetup in Boston. And the interesting thing we would do is we would spend hours and weeks trying to actually find people to interview. It was a really interesting phenomenon. Someone would say, hey, we heard a rumor that Salesforce.com's got someone doing Agile. And I would go on LinkedIn and I would send 10 or 15 in-mail messages and I'd get nothing back. So that was 2010, 2011, 2012. Yeah. Nowadays, it's significantly easier for us to find guests, and because across the marketing spectrum, people are trying and experimenting with a lot of different parts of marketing to use Agile.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the use cases that we hear most are things like marketing automation, things where iteration and testing would be very easy to implement. And we'll talk about some of those use cases in a minute. One thing that I just want to mention about where agile marketing is coming from, it is mostly being driven by mid-level managers and people who are actually doing the work in the trenches, people who are on agile implementation teams today. That can be functional team leaders. It can be true agile team leaders. Because of that, Agile is sort of popping up in different silos within the enterprise. It's not the dominant experience that you see today is not a consistent application of Agile across the company. It's more that we see entrepreneurial marketers who have realized that Agile is really well adapted for some of the problems that they're trying to solve, and they start using it. And those leaders are building the case for it internally and trying to get broader adoption. So that's kind of where things are today.
Yeah, and with that we've talked to We've got a podcast actually that's recorded and not posted with Vistaprint, where that was the first one we've talked to where it was an enterprise-wide initiative to do Agile, and marketing was a big part of it.
Yeah.
Beyond that, a lot of the folks we talk to come from, were in technology companies, had maybe a development background, got exposed to it because they were a developer and got their MBA, or moved over to marketing or worked with marketing, and that's how they kind of brought it in and infected the marketing team with Agile.
Yeah. So I want to talk for a minute about what it means to scale Agile. Because for us really to talk about Agile adoption and Agile marketing as a new part of our discipline, we really have to talk a little bit about scale. So that's where we're going to start there. And for us, when we think about scale, there's really two dimensions to it. There's the sort of lateral scale where you see those practitioners that I mentioned, those team leaders, sharing with their colleagues and spreading the approach horizontally across the company, establishing Agile teams. But then there's another dimension of scale, which is scaling up vertically through the company and finding ways to get leadership aligned at a strategic level with the work that's happening at the level of these Agile teams. And that is harder to do. So both of these things scaling in both dimensions are hard, but vertically is more challenging. It's something we'll talk a little bit about when we get to our first challenge. So the question comes up, is Agile hard to scale? The answer is yes. But I'd ask you to just, if you're not familiar with Dunbar's number, how many of you are familiar with Dunbar's number? Yes, okay, one or two. So basically, Dunbar's number says that human beings have a capacity to maintain a certain amount of close relationships. So once you get beyond that number of people that you can have close relationships with, it's hard to have the social connection that you would need to collaborate effectively. And so Dunbar's number is kind of an upper limit, or sets the beginning of an upper limit to how well collaboration can scale. Now, we've got tools that can help us stay connected with more people. You know, in a project management context, that could be something like Jira or Trello or Asana, or even think about the way that you use Facebook, right? I'm quite certain that most of you have more than 150 friends on Facebook. And tools can help us extend our network. But the reality is, at the end of the day, it's those relationships that we need to make collaboration work. And so part of the reason why it's hard to scale Agile is because of things like Dunbar's number limits the number of relationships that we can really have. But what's important to understand here is that that is not exclusive to Agile marketing. You face those exact same scale problems with Waterfall. So fundamentally, the approach is not harder to scale than Waterfall. It's just hard to scale because it's hard to scale when there's humans are involved.
And if you think about developers, you know, they have this idea of the mythical man month, and these are concepts that go back 40 years in the development world, where the number, as a team gets larger, the number of connections from person to person increase, and ultimately the amount of the communications overhead increases more than proportional to the number of people. So that also increases the difficulty in terms of scaling a process like Agile.
You want to take this one?
Want to grab this?
Okay, sure. So what do you need for Agile to scale? So first of all, Agile is not appropriate for every context. Agile works really well in contexts where it's hard to predict the future. Oftentimes when companies are being disrupted or they're in fast-moving markets, that's a good place to consider implementing Agile. You also need an Agilist or an internal leader who's going to really drive the adoption of Agile, coach people on the Agile implementation teams, and also mentor executives in the company and educate them about Agile. From a leadership perspective, you have to have a willingness to be able to restructure. The concept of the cross-functional team is really critical to the success of Agile, and that does mean restructuring, moving away from often very functional oriented organizations towards these cross-functional teams. And you have to have a willingness to empower people in the company to come with ideas and to drive the business from the bottom up. One of the things we'll talk about a little later on is the fact that about 60% of the innovation and direction when you're using Agile is going to come from the bottom up, if not more. So that is, that's something that leadership needs to get comfortable with and to embrace in order to really scale Agile inside the company.
And as you start to think about where we are with Agile today, and Roland and I will show some slides a little bit later on about the adoption level. As I mentioned, we started the podcast in 2010, and we're starting to look at where the market is. I would actually posit that we're still probably in the first 1% to 2% of adoption of Agile by marketers. When you start to think about classic technology adoption lifecycle stuff like Jeffrey Moore and Clay Christensen, people have probably read a lot of those books, The Innovator's Dilemma and things like that. Well, when you get to the middle of the market, there is some kind of dominant design that emerges. That what it is fairly standard, and a whole ecosystem develops around it, right? I mean, a lot of you guys and startups are trying to develop your own ecosystems. Well, right now, from the people we've talked to in the podcast, there isn't a standard approach to Agile that marketers taking. We have people who are generally less dogmatic than their brethren in development using Agile, and people who are trying to figure it out, to figure out. And so there's still what I describe as the waterfall overlay, that we as marketers still have. There's parts of marketing that Roland just referred to a few moments ago. There's parts of marketing which may never go Agile. Yeah. I'm planning a user conference in July. You know what we did this morning? We built a giant spreadsheet, waterfall spreadsheet for that event. Because, you know what? That event is 60 days from now. There's no uncertainty, and it's going to be fairly certain of what we need to do between now and then. So, long story short, I think that as the market starts to mature, as people start to really define what Agile marketing is in a very specific way, then the ecosystem will evolve, the Agile marketing coaches will show up, and things will, and then it will be much more standard. But until then, we haven't crossed the chasm. We're really in a very early state in this market.
Yeah, and I think that there's probably a parallel here to the amount of marketing technology that's making its way into our lives as well, and our adoption of that technology and actually success with that technology. It's still very early days. So I think that there's some parallels there. So this is enterprise specific, but one of the things that I've observed, and again, this isn't based on formal research, this is sort of anecdotal evidence from our conversations, is that, it's very rare that you have a leader in the marketing organization or even a CEO who comes to the company and has recognized the value of Agile and is going to drive it down into the organization. Now, we've talked to some people who that is the case, but that is the exception, not the rule. You have an incredible advantage if you have a leader who is coming to the table with that mindset already. About 60%, the largest number of people that we talk to, are in a state which I started describing a minute ago, where there are teams within the company with entrepreneurial leaders on top of them that have discovered that Agile is very useful, and it helps them be more productive, and it helps them get to product market fit, or it helps them get to more value more quickly. But what we also see is that those companies can get into a state where those teams are functioning just fine, but they're not actually spreading Agile further, and they're not driving further adoption, and they're not necessarily converting leadership into advocates for this approach. And sometimes we see those companies, particularly when a leader would leave that company, one of those people who was a proponent of Agile, the team falls back on the traditional way of working, and Agile doesn't necessarily stick. So there's a lot of risk being there. Then there's a smaller subset of companies for whom they're able to use the examples internally to really start convincing leadership that it's going to play a very, very important role in the future of the business. It's going to help the business be competitive. And those companies are the ones that I see as being the most likely to succeed with Agile over the long term.
Yeah, and it's an interesting phenomenon when you take the top-down approach. How many times have people heard the word, we need to be more agile, and I use that as the little a agile. Yeah. That is, just do the same thing, but just do it faster, versus big A agile. which is what we're talking about, which is adapting the techniques of Agile, which the development world is known for more than a decade. And those are things that, the word Agile gets tossed around all the time. A lot of people, you think about a lot of CMOs don't come from technology backgrounds. They may come from an agency background or a creative background or a communications background. So they may not even be introduced to the idea of Agile.
Yep. So this is a good place to jump into the challenge section of the presentation. We want to walk you through 6 challenges that we hear a lot. The first one is about executive buy-in, so it's a good transition from what we were just talking about. And the challenges of getting executives behind the Agile marketing approach. There's a great quote here from Charlie Treadwell, who was a guest on the podcast, who made a comment which I have to say resonated with me. I'm not super excited about the fact that I think that he might be right. It's that maybe by the time we get that leadership in place, that leadership is going to be us. It's going to be those people who are leading those Agile implementations today within a silo. Those people are going to, because they're going to have more success, they're going to find themselves in leadership positions, and when they get there, they're going to be more willing to drive the Agile practice into the company. So some of the things that we see working really well in this context to get executive buy-in. One is, I talked about Agile coaches a little bit, or having an Agilist inside your company who's going to own the process. So that individual needs to, part of their job is about educating executives in the company. And sometimes that will mean enlisting outside resources to help them do that. One of the things that Frank and I have seen happen just in the last, I would say 3 or 4 months, is that some of the major consulting companies out there that have a lot of experience with change management and that executives trust are building out Agile marketing groups because they see that this is going to be a really, really critical aspect of change management, and they see that there's a real need for it in the marketplace. So it's a combination of your internal Agilist building those pilots and case studies and selling them up to the executives, and then partnering at times maybe with some of these firms to get over the line and get more commitment. Anything to add there?
No.
Okay.
That's great. Yeah. And one of the big challenges that we often hear is, particularly in larger organizations, is the cadence of results in a business. If you think about a traditional public company, maybe like Oracle, for example, they're kind of beholden to the standard quarterly earnings cycle, annual planning, annual goals, and that connection between the short-term iteration and shorter-term cycles of Agile and the longer-term corporate cadence of planning and the corporate cultures of planning, that ends up being a real challenge for a lot of these businesses. And what we've seen in some of the podcasts are people looking to adapt frameworks like the Google OKR framework to do planning and bridge that gap between the traditional, higher level goals that cascade down into lower level goals, which ultimately can be used as an input to the Agile process.
And I'm just curious, how many people are familiar with the OKR framework here? Just a couple? Okay. Just for reference, there's a great link on our podcast to some incredible videos from Google about the framework. It was actually introduced to Google by John Doerr very early on. And I won't get too deep into it, but the basic idea is that you set goals. Every individual in the company sets goals and a set of metrics to assess whether or not you met that goal. And as you go down the hierarchy of the company, those goals cascade such that you should be able to show how your goals roll up into your manager's goals and so on. So it's a good way of driving alignment between what the Agile team is doing and the executive direction that the company is going in. So one of the other things that we're trying to point to with the graphic here is just that, there are feedback. Agile thrives on feedback, right? It thrives on constant feedback to help you validate the things that you've put out into the marketplace. And typically your average Agile team needs that feedback to be coming in quickly after they provide that release. And they're getting it from web analytics and from social media and, from instrumentation in the product itself and things like that. But there are other kinds of feedback that come in from more traditional practices, whether that's a traditional research practice that takes a quarter to run, whether it's a channel partner that you have, that only can give you feedback on a quarterly basis, or something more traditional like a customer advisory board that's representing a different segment or a different part of your constituent. So what the OKR framework can help you do is reconcile that strategic feedback with that constant feedback that you're getting from your everyday analytics, right? And help you make decisions that are helping you determine whether you're going to go left or right as you make pivots. All right. Whoops. I cleverly built in many builds into this. Well done. You
Two more. Okay, 3 more.
Feel free to jump in here.
So one of the other challenges that you face when you're using Agile, if you're in a venture-funded startup like where I work, my marketing team is 3 people. My product owner in the Agile world is my CEO. And, I have my major stakeholders, the head of sales or the head of R&D. They join the party. That works great in a startup environment. But as you get bigger, that line of communications, as Roland alluded to earlier, starts to become much more challenging. So what I've seen in bigger companies is the idea of, we lose our
Can't
signal. Can't be done, is looking at the idea of a scrum of scrums, that you do your scrum. Or I've worked in one company where the product scrum would be at 9 o'clock and the marketing scrum would be at 9:15. That this kind of communication, people are still trying to figure some of that out. But there aren't a lot of case studies for organizations yet who have scaled Agile in a marketing department. Yeah. But there are some models out there, and Roland can share a little bit from like the Spotify model.
Yeah, so what we talked the challenge before was about how you scale vertically up through the company. This is much more focused about how do you deal with that horizontal scale, because it's easy for these horizontal teams to get out of sync with each other. And so Spotify has this really, I think, this slide, which is defying the clicker that I'm working with, but I'll just talk through it. So Spotify basically, it's basically like a modern or more contemporary version of a matrix organization. So, they have this idea that if you have standalone Agile implementation teams that are working on a specific initiative, you might have 10 of those teams running in parallel. Well, how do you keep them in sync so that they're using, for example, the same design patterns or the same UI, or great ideas that bubble up in one team that other teams can take advantage of those ideas? So they call the Agile implementation team a squad. So squads that are working on the same surface area, that's an affinity group. And so those squads can have, for example, a shared scrum or a scrum of scrums. Or you can have working horizontally across your different squads. You can have, for example, each one of those Agile teams might have a design practitioner or a developer. So you can pull those apart as, a chapter or a guild. So implementing this sort of more contemporary matrix structure can help you break down some of the lack of communication that is often happening in silos, and it can be a very effective, I think, tool for Agile teams to stay in sync. Okay, so I'm just curious, how many people in this room are familiar with some of the dominant Agile methods like Kanban, Scrum? Okay, good, great. So one of the challenges that marketers have is that Agile was not designed for marketing. It was designed for development and is used, then was adopted by product management. So in marketing, we need to adapt marketing to our context. And that means we also, when I think about Agile is really an approach. Underneath the approach, we've got these methods that we use to make that approach, put it in action. But really, methods are just a collection of practices that we have. And so marketers need to sort of tailor their method to the company culture, to the project that they're working on. And there is a spectrum of methods, from less prescriptive methods to more prescriptive methods. And I think what we've heard on the podcast is that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, marketers had a tendency to start with methods that were too prescriptive. And maybe one of the dominant reasons for that was that they were trying to accept influence from their product management peers, who were entirely good-intentioned in trying to teach them about how to use Agile, but who were coming from a much more technical background and who were much more comfortable with highly prescriptive methods. So, in general, I think my advice, or our advice, or what we're hearing on the podcast, is that it's best to start actually with something much less prescriptive, like Kanban, and add practices as you go, as you build your practices, and as you get to a more robust Agile implementation.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I spoke at an event up in the state of Maine. Yes, the state of Maine on the East Coast, because my hometown is Boston, and I went out to the crowd, and I see someone pumping a fist up there, and talked a little bit about how, what I do at my team is probably 60 or 70% of what most Agile people do. And maybe in some ways looks a lot more like a Kanban in terms of workflow. But we get, from that 60 or 70%, we get 90% of the value of doing it and managing the workflow and not being so dogmatic about it. And to be honest with you, I've spent the last 15 years in venture-funded startups. I find writing a marketing plan an absolute and utter waste of time, because it stays relevant for about 30 minutes or 45 minutes, and then you're rewriting it by next week. So for us, having a lightweight, adaptive, flexible methodology is really important. But a lot of developers, again, a much more mature approach to Agile, would shriek at the approach of, wouldn't call it Agile, wouldn't call it even Kanban, because it's some strange hybrid. And most of the marketers we talk to are anywhere from 40% to 80% Agile, and have large swaths of their team that are still in waterfall land.
But it is also worth acknowledging, on the other hand, that, and maybe we'll get to this at the end, that, that is different than the people who are talking about little a Agile and being little a Agile, right? Just because it's less prescriptive doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all, and that there are still hard practices that we adhere to for it to legitimately be Agile. You should start with this one.
Want to talk a little bit about this? So, one of the things that with Agile is to try and connect, your customer experience and your users to what you're doing in marketing. And user stories are really one way that people do this. So at the highest level, marketers are starting to embrace epics, trying to come up with these high-level themes, then break these epics down into user stories, which then can be translated into specific tasks that you use on a daily basis. From the people we talk to, I would estimate probably 50% are using user stories and 50% are not. And that's, again, comes back to the fact that the lack of maturity in how people are using Agile in marketing, and, again, the lack of a dominant design and a dominant approach.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the guidelines section here, I just have some of the things that sort of bubble up to the top. I will say that a lot of this comes from a specific podcast that we had with a guy named Jim Ewell, who has a great blog that you should check out called at agilemarketing.net. But the first one is about, you're writing about the goal, not how to accomplish it. Like, it's in other words, your goal might be to, drive awareness for a specific product. It's not a webinar. Like, a webinar is one way of achieving that goal. The user story is more general than that. As Frank mentioned, it's best to start with your epics and then start breaking them down into more granular stories, and keep breaking them down until you get them to a scale at which you can deliver on that story or complete that story in a day or two. That takes some practice when it comes to figuring out how to scope stories, but that's a goal to aspire to. And then, you will have internal user stories where, the classic format I have here, as a blank, I want to do blank so that I can get this benefit, right? More often than not, like the vast majority of the time, you want the role to be a customer role or somebody in the community that you're trying to serve. But as a marketer, sometimes it is going to be a marketer or a salesperson where you're building something for a salesperson. And that's okay, but the goal should be to keep that under 25% of the time. And then finally, make sure that in your sprint planning, or if you're not running time box sprints, even if you're in the context of Kanban, make sure that you do have a planning meeting, and at some point in that planning meeting, you should be doing, generally grooming-like activities where you're looking through your backlog and you're trying to scope those things. But more than anything else, you need to look at those user stories and continually find ways to get better at writing user stories, because it is a challenge for marketers to do it. Okay.
So this was the point that I made a few moments ago, is how agile are marketers. And Peter Bellante, recent guest on the podcast from Autodesk. And, if you look at how agile people are, it can vary anywhere from 40% to 80%, depending upon what the teams are. There are certain parts of a marketing function which don't lend themselves very well to agile. And I alluded to a few minutes ago, event planning, corporate communications. We had a guest on from Intralinks, a secure data room company, and he was talking about, look, we have earnings each quarter. I know at the beginning of the year when the 4 earnings calls are going to be. I know when I have to have the press release out to the capital markets, or they're going to panic and crush my stock. I know when the auditors are going to be done with the financials. There's no uncertainty in any of that stuff, other than maybe what's in that release for results. But those things may never be. They may actually never be agile. We had Mike Volpe on, former CMO at HubSpot. I know it's like a big Boston company. People probably don't know them quite as well out here. But I saw him speak at the Boston Agile Marketing Meetup, and he said, they were an early proponent of Agile in marketing, and he said the larger we get, the less we use Agile. So they were getting more and more waterfall as they were bringing people in, and also doing things like buying more media. Certainly some parts of media you can buy on the spot market, but there's still a tremendous amount of media out there as marketers that we can only buy in the upfront, or we can only buy once a year. So some of those things are never going to be agile, and that's something that we kind of have to reconcile. And again, I use the term waterfall overlay because there's always going to be a certain amount of what we do that's waterfall. It's just a question of how much and how it fits.
Are you saying I should have the waterfall line on top?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the fact that Mike's comment also speaks to the fact, that was a few years ago, and I think it speaks to the fact that scaling up vertically through the organization and getting scale is tough. It's hard to do. I think that marketers are a little farther along. At least the leading marketers who are implementing agile marketing are a little farther along and have more tools for combating the fact that companies, as they get bigger, want to fall back on waterfall, but it's still very, very hard. There is also, it's not just that some things in your portfolio are better suited to waterfall. It's also that there are going to be some things that are just overhead, and your agile team doesn't get 100% of their time to give to the agile process. So, there are lots of things that they may be responsible for, which just, aren't necessarily a particular event program, but are just part of their day-to-day work. It's stuff that they have to do that's not going to fit into Agile. And so We've asked marketers, and I think we're going to continue to ask marketers, what percentage of the person's time is actually dedicated to working on the Agile team? And, it can be 50% or less. We wanted to ask a question of folks in the room. I'm just kind of curious, how many people actually feel like they've got an Agile implementation going at your company? Okay, so a few. Just would you mind just sharing with us quickly about how much of the team's time would you say is dedicated to actually working in an Agile context versus more waterfall stuff?
Probably around 70% in our case.
70% Agile?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. How about you guys?
65.
65?
I looked it up before.
All right. All right. Sounds good. So a little bit more on horizontal scale. So again, coming back to the internal Agilist or your coach, that person can really, really help drive some scale horizontally across your organization by providing training. And they can also bring in outside trainers to accelerate that process. So speaking from my own experience, when I was at Involver, we engaged with a company called Pivotal, who paired with us paired with people from our team, really accelerated our adoption of Agile because they were there with us doing 3 iterations of a project. So we weren't just relying on an internal Agile leader. We had outside resources helping us. But then we basically took those teams that we had that were up and running, and we split those teams apart and made each of the members of that team the leader of a new team, basically the scrum master of a new team. So that can be a very, very effective way of scaling horizontally. And then the last part that I already talked a little bit about is developing your own method as a sort of shared toolkit can really help support scale, because the teams that you're spinning up don't have to start from scratch with their own method. They can inherit the method of some of the other teams that have already figured out what works inside your company culture and the kinds of projects that you're working on.
Yeah, and it's a phenomenon, as I alluded to before. Vistaprint was someone we recently interviewed, and they had gone very agile, like from the top down, and made a serious commitment to it. But some of I asked the question of, how uniform is your process? And you'd be surprised, even at a public company, larger organization, at a high level, the principles, the philosophy, the attitudes were uniform, but at a lower level, there was not a uniform 1 week, 2 week, 4 week sprint. There was not a uniform approach, not always necessarily exactly the same tools and approaches, but at a high level, the philosophy and the attitude and the culture about how they were going to run the organization was very uniform.
Yeah, I agree. So I would just clarifying my last comment, the method that you give these teams is kind of like the starter kit, but they're going to adapt that method, and you're going to see, I think, exactly what Frank was talking about, which is this divergence of methods to some degree, because different teams are working on different parts of your marketing, and those different parts have different needs, and they're going to require different practices. I did want to spend just a quick minute talking a little bit about how to leverage outside resources. Contractors, for example, in our experience, can be helpful to supplement an Agile team, but to actually have a standalone team of contractors where contractors outnumber the dedicated team members is not a good formula for success. It also helps if you have longer-term relationships with contractors, because putting somebody into an Agile team and trying to expect them to conform to the way that team is working and make contributions and then pulling them out quickly, it's not easy. They're going to need time to ramp up to really get productive and to get into the method of that team and really get gelling as a cross-functional team. We've talked with a bunch of agencies on the podcast. Our experience is that agencies are kind of struggling to figure out what their role is to play, to be frank, around Agile. Again, it's hard for agencies to interoperate with an Agile team. Agencies can themselves operate in an Agile way, but that's usually a standalone Agile team that's outside of your company. And then there's the consultants that I mentioned that, like the McKinseys and the Boston Consulting Groups, who can help you with change management and who can also come in and help you do that tactical Agile education and training across your Agile teams. All right, so this is the last section. We're running perfect timing. We've got about 15 minutes left. So this is where we were going to share just sort of a little bit of our perspective that wasn't necessarily something we heard directly from a marketer that we spoke to, but is more what I would describe just some of the conversations that Frank and I have had. So there's something called the Beyond Budgeting movement, and there's a guy named Bjart Bionis. I'm sure I'm pronouncing his last name wrong. But he wrote a great book called Beyond Budgeting, and this example is from his book. But I think it's a really good metaphor to think about what it takes for Agile to succeed within an enterprise, particularly from a leadership level. I see Agile being kind of more like the roundabout here compared to the stoplight, where Agile is this thing where you're letting the teams that are in the trenches actually doing the work make decisions in real time based on real data that they are getting right then and there. And that tends to lead to better decisions. But it requires that you can accept a world in which decisions are distributed and trust those teams to know that they need to connect back to the strategic vision of where the company is headed. And that trust, I think, can be hard. And I think it's actually also just very hard to... It's harder for the team in the sense that they're faced with harder decisions to make. But we should try and do this, and we should try and do this harder thing because the results are better. And it's worth the amount better for the extra work and the extra responsibility that those teams are taking on, right? The alternative is this model where, the stoplight, where we're making all of these decisions in advance, where the executive management hands down the strategic direction at the beginning of the year or even the beginning of the quarter, and all the decisions that we're making are conforming to that strategic direction, but that aren't actually aware of the latest data of what's happening in the marketplace, right? That strategic, as soon as it's authored, it's out of date, and it may be out of sync with what's actually happening in the market.
Yeah, and Roland alluded to the fact that it does put a greater pressure on your organization. It's one of our earliest guests on the podcast was a CMO of a bank in Tennessee, and he was talking about how Agile helped him identify the high performers on his team, because his high performers on the team embraced the uncertainty and were really impatient for process, whereas the weakest members of their team had their spreadsheet, had their annual plan, and clung to it as tight as they could, because that was the thing that allowed them to be certain of what they needed to do. Smart people can be pretty impatient because they can digest things quickly and move and adjust and adapt, and that's the world we live in today as marketers.
Yeah. It goes without saying, if the slide is not clear, roundabouts have much more throughput than a traffic light, if you're not aware of that.
You have roundabouts out here?
We have a few of them.
3.
Yes.
In New England, there's in the Northeast, there are lots and lots. I think it comes back to our British ancestors.
Exactly.
I guess. Yeah.
Excellent. Right, exactly. So some of the value, I'm sure that you've already gotten from our conversation where some of the value is, but as you talk to your leadership, some of the things that rise to the surface that we hear about, right? Improve employee satisfaction. It's really fun to work on a small cross-functional team. You get to, when you do that, the work that you're doing in any iteration, sometimes there's more design, sometimes there's more development work to be done, and that means that if you're the designer when you have more free cycles, you're going to get to work a little bit more on the development challenges. That's not necessarily mean you don't have to necessarily code, but it may mean that you're going to be doing scoping of stories, and it may mean that you're going to be doing testing and things like that. And so it gives you much more deep understanding of what your colleague is doing, the space in which he's operating. When you're on a small cross-functional team working with people like that, understanding each other's discipline at a deeper level, you get to come up with more creative and interesting solutions to problems. And one byproduct of that is that people enjoy doing this work more. So it benefits employee sat. It also leads to increased productivity, which we talked a little bit about in the last slide. Faster to product market fit. One thing that is a personal pet peeve for me is when people say that Agile is faster. It is not necessarily faster. Like, if you know exactly where you're going and you're implementing waterfall can be incredibly efficient and very, very fast.
Yeah, in places where there's lots of uncertainty, and you're trying to learn along the way, certainly they're more tailored to Agile. Things where there's a lot of certainty, there's not necessarily a need for it.
Yeah. But faster to product market fit, yes, that is for sure. Increased quality of output. We've seen that obviously in the development context, but I think on the marketing side we see it because we're validating the work that we're creating with data relatively quickly after we create it. And then, lower planning overhead, basically because there's more transparency. If you set up that contemporary matrix organization, you can hopefully reduce some of the overhead with these very long and involved planning processes, and also you can reduce duplication if you have got good transparency across these teams and exposed backlogs, basically.
Can I grab this?
Sure. So, from my perspective, like, what is really Agile? Is it a holistic solution to do everything that you're going to do as a marketer? No, it's not. I see it more as a substrate on which to improve collaboration and to drive alignment in many cases between product management and marketing, which I see as the two drivers of the company. But doing that and adopting Agile, you're really building a culture. You're taking on a different kind of culture. One that says out loud, we are not good at predicting the future. And we're going to address that by doing small things, putting them out into the market, testing them, getting data, and iterating and zeroing in on product market fit. Acknowledging that and saying it out loud and building it into your culture, that's really what this is about. It's not about getting to a feature that's going to make you more competitive, because features can be replicated. What's really hard for companies to replicate is this culture. Very, very hard to actually get Agile in place and up and running and get your company and everybody at the company on board with this approach.
And it's challenging. You think about, we as marketers are a hero-driven culture, hero-driven organizations. We give awards to the greatest marketers. There's a certain amount of arrogance among the creative geniuses in the world. But the other fact is, when you work in an Agile approach, you're almost sort of surrendering to the process, and you're almost admitting that we don't know what we don't know, and we need a process that's adaptive to help us work in this uncertain environment.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's interesting to see, I give Roland credit for these graphs, these next two graphs, because I think they're really great. But if anyone who's been tracking the Agile marketing movement, you see, compared to the term lean or the lean movement, Agile and marketing is really starting to gain some traction. That people are starting to talk about it more. As I alluded to back in 2010, 2011, it was pretty much impossible to find someone to talk to about Agile. And now we do 3 podcasts a month, and there are people to talk to, and we've got a backlog of guests. So certainly there's a lot of traction, and there's a lot of people. And like I always joke that when anything new comes into the marketing world, the pundits come out of the woodwork, and everyone hangs a blog and then becomes an expert at it. Whereas, we've been trying to focus on talking to practitioners, and the practitioners do exist now in some quantity.
Yeah, just the idea of the term Agile marketing also is worth noting. Like, is that term going to really stay? Are we going to be talking about agile marketing in 5 years from now? I don't know. My own view is that term is useful insofar as it gives us something to talk about and to network around and to share best practices around. But it's more about the practices than that term. But as much credibility as agile marketing and traction is getting relative to lean marketing, as you'll see, compared to something like inbound marketing, it's still a teeny blip on the radar. So, we think, just to say it again, it's still pretty early days, right? And what is going to get something like agile marketing to have this kind of currency amongst marketers, right? So let's talk about what made inbound marketing, right? There were a couple of companies, HubSpot being one of them, that invested very, very heavily in building equity in that term. And, making it into what it is today. So that may happen with agile marketing. It may not, right? The Boston Consulting Groups and McKinsey's are starting to write a lot about agile. Harvard Business Review, small agencies, medium-sized agencies, some product companies. So I think it's TBD, but I do think it's kind of worth acknowledging that it's still very, very early, and that is evidenced by this data point. All right. That brings us to the end of the insights portion of the presentation, and hopefully we can take a question or two from you all.
So, as you were talking, I was thinking about Brent might be considered commensurate with growth hacking because it's not the same, but it's kind of doing sprints on a weekly basis to test a lot of ideas, iterate. What works, what doesn't work, throw it out.
I would. Sorry, do you want to take?
No, I was going to say I agree with you. I mean, I think a lot of the core principles. If you did a bit of Venn diagram of lean and growth hacking and agile, there'd be a lot of overlap in the middle.
Yeah.
Right. And then now we're getting. I went to another panel discussion earlier this week, or maybe it was last week. And they were talking about account-based marketing.
Yeah.
And I think that personally, I think that's a misnomer. I think it should be called account-based sales rather than marketing.
I love that.
It's been around a long time.
Yeah.
The list guys are trying to make themselves relevant again. We know that.
And
Yeah.
the term inbound marketing, I mean, if you throw enough money at something,
Sure.
just like Salesforce threw at SaaS, which was around for more than a decade before it was SaaS.
Sure.
And it's easier.
But the result is still that marketers are,
Exactly. But inbound, when you talk about inbound marketing versus agile marketing, inbound marketing is a lot more accessible for people. It's, if you write content, you publish content.
Totally. To be fair, I did that mostly just to be provocative and put things in context a little bit.
Yeah.
It worked.
But also think about marketing.
Inbound marketing is a hot button to me because I come from an email marketing background.
But I always think that marketers would like to talk about the what and not the how. The what's much more interesting. We get awards for the what. There's no award for the how. There's no Agile Marketer of the Year award, but there's a Content Marketer of the Year award, and you get the loose site trophies and all that stuff. Well,
Started.
yeah.
So
We got to give out loose site trophies then. That's a good idea.
agile marketing is going to be a methodology.
Right.
Until
Well, Agile is
figures
a
out
methodology, though.
How to capitalize on it and throw a ton of money at making it a household term.
Yeah, I mean, that actually goes a little bit back to your comment about growth hacking. I mean, I see growth hacking as, and from my perspective, it's just an agile method.
Sorry?
It's just an agile method.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yep. So yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there may be there's certainly a convergence that's taking place in the market between Agile and Lean. As Frank said, they have much more in common than they have different.
And the other question that I often rant about is there such a thing as Agile marketing, or is it marketing using Agile? Because Agile is a mature thing. I still challenge someone to tell me, and no one's ever told me this, what's the difference between Agile for marketers than Agile in developers? Now, our vernacular is different. We use it slightly different, but Agile is Agile is Agile. So we're marketers. We brand things. This is what we do for a living. So we have to be special. We want to feel special. We're precious snowflakes. We're marketers. So we give it its own name. We give it its own thing. And that's okay. But fact of the matter is, Agile is a known thing. It's not something new that we just made up a couple of years ago as marketers.
Yeah.
The developers, and most developers, I speak at a lot of developer events. I often get invited as the token marketer. And I always get the question. They always say, I don't get it. You're just doing Agile. So we as marketers, maybe we just need to embrace Agile.
Right.
And just call it Agile.
Just call it Agile. Yeah,
right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sure. So my question is, how do you guys envision agile marketing in the context of all the other organizational functions within a company? For example, one of our top clients got more than 100 million monthly active users. The type of project that we get involved with them on a bi-weekly basis, we coordinate with them, say, new features, but they internally have to coordinate with people like data analysts, with product, with engineers, will also use Agile for themselves. So how do you cascade, you guys envision to coordinate the priorities set for marketing with the other functions? Because in the end, things are converging. I mean, there's not such thing as marketing as a silo.
Right.
There's a lot of tech dependencies to even enable the use cases that you're having vision in your stories. In Agile, well, you have to make those happen, and many times you're going to need developers, designers, and data analysts, which might belong to other organizations. So you need to coordinate across the company. Yeah.
Can I take that one first? There's a couple pieces to that. So for one thing, marketing organizations increasingly have those roles in it, right? So those roles are migrating into the marketing organization, one. Two, because these two groups, look, here's what doesn't work, is when product management is using Agile and marketing is using Waterfall. And they're iterating month to month to month, and the marketing team's 6 months later and saying, okay, we're ready to launch this awesome thing, which you're not making anymore. And in fact, you've gone in a completely different direction, right? So the whole point of marketers adopting Agile and working on, they don't necessarily have to be, the sprints don't have to be in sync. But the fact that they've got iterations that are on, they're coming up for linkages much more often and syncing up much more often, and they understand each other's process and each other's language, goes a long way to breaking down these barriers and keeping these two organizations in sync. That wasn't really happening before. So I think that's fundamentally how you get these two organizations much more aligned.
Yeah, and what's to stop? These are arbitrary R&D, marketing, sales. I mean, those are arbitrary. In a startup environment, like you're in a startup environment, so maybe you're lucky you don't have probably as many barriers, sit in the same room. But as you get to bigger companies, these arbitrary organizational silos can be kind of arbitrary. And you see in companies that are embracing it that developers, and we interviewed a guy recently from EMC, and different people from different teams parachute into it depending on what they're working on.
This is exactly what the Spotify model is trying to break down. It's basically saying, instead of having these functional silos like design, where you've got a design team that's sitting in marketing and a separate design team that's sitting in development, it's saying, well, you're going to have design distributed across Agile teams. And those designers are going to be part of this guild. And as designers, they are going to get together and have a regular cadence of meetings so that they can talk about, well, here's what we're doing with the brand system inside the product. Here's what we're doing with the brand system outside of the product. We should really make sure that these things are cut from the same cloth. And it's that sort of more contemporary matrix organization which helps ensure that that happens.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I'm actually familiar with work with Spotify and also other companies like Supercell. That's actually what they call Supercell, because they have cells that create the actual game. They're very independent, that have all these functions built in within.
Okay.
Previously, I was at EA, which had 9,000 people by then, and we have to coordinate all these marketing efforts and data efforts and A/B tests in a way that, it can take a lot of time. Sometimes things will get done in 6 months, a year, since the moment that you have to post it, because, as you're saying, maybe development is using waterfall, but marketing is much more impatient, and then you have all this friction between who is really enabling the functionality versus what the marketing want to achieve in what time. So I see that the problem is more at a high level, and that the green needs to be adopted, although it's tougher as you
Yes.
It is a culture that needs to be adopted at a high level.
Agree.
That's why you have Spotify, having defined those guilds and different functions, because that was defined at executive level, and it can't really.
So it gets to that stagnate group, whereas if you don't get executive buy-in at some point, you're going to run into the problems with, miscommunication across silos or lack of alignment, for sure. This is why the executive buy-in is so important to make it scale.
You've mentioned that agencies are having trouble finding out kind of where they fit into Agile and if it makes sense for them at all. I'm curious because I work at a nonprofit and our very small marketing team serves kind of like an internal agency to the other programmatic aspects of the organization.
Yep.
And wondering if you could speak more to that, like what are the challenges that they're facing or what are they finding that's working?
So think about agencies. I mean, a traditional agency, a creative agency, maybe someone external to your company. It's a crummy, low-margin business. People services business. You're constantly pitching.
Tell them what
hard
you
to
really
make
think.
money. What's that?
Tell them what you really think.
Tell them what I think. But it's awesome because you get to wear ironic T-shirts and bring your dog to the office. All that good stuff. But they put you in TV shows. I make the soul patch joke, but Roland's got a soul patch, so I can't make that joke. I need to grow one too. So, but the tough businesses to be in. And, my hypothesis, and from talking to agency people, is that creative briefs and all the trappings of waterfall are what they use to control their margins. It's I spec something, I price it, and then I deliver it. And that's it. If you want to change, you issue a change order. And waterfall is, and the person who runs the shop is a traffic person who's basically a planner. And that's the way they all were built. However, we've interviewed people on the podcast recently who come from agency environments who are doing much, much more creative approaches. For example, pricing per sprint and pricing per points per sprint, which looks maybe a little bit more like a retainer, looks a little bit more like a size, sizing ahead of time, and it requires a whole heck of a lot more trust and a much tighter, more tightly coupled relationship. There are some really progressive people who are trying these things. They're not perfect, but I used to, until we've interviewed a few people over the last few months, think that was going to be the reason why Agile never got adopted by marketing or at great levels, because of the agencies, when in fact the more progressive agencies are very much embracing it.
Yeah, I think the other problem is that marketers are increasingly realizing that in order to be competitive, they've got to take this stuff in-house. They've got to own it. I mean, not everything. There's some things that aren't core to their business they can still rely on agencies for. But if it's core to the business, they've got to have that team internally. Like, they're just not going to have the insight and the access to be able to succeed. It's related to this idea that it's a shift away from, I'm going to work on a campaign that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I'm going to move to a world in which I've got a product or a program, and I just run that program, and just on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and you think about what happened in the development world. There, I'm in the software world. Is we're a world of continuous. You're continuous delivery. You're continuous, and marketing is a lot like that now as well. I work in an open source world, and the code gets pushed to the repository. This automation, the code might update daily. Software developers and IT guys are delivering, and we in marketing are doing the same thing now. We're having to deliver changes to your email or changes to your website daily or hourly. So, question.
So I have a question. I don't know how we are on time. Maybe we can carry it into the happy hour. But you guys talked about culture, and there was a great quote up there. Quote, "Culture eats strategy for business."
For breakfast.
Breakfast, yeah.
Yes.
You talked about agencies and what their role is and being meaningful, and then this whole agile context. What happens when you have a culture within a company that's formed over time, and you need a change agent that you can't get on the inside? And so, do you bring in an agency?
You're talking about McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group's current business plan and why they are investing so heavily in building out full-fledged agile consulting teams, both consulting for the executive and consulting for the agile implementation team. They see this opportunity, and they are absolutely gearing up and taking talent out of the market to build these teams. Yep, and they're actually taking talent out of agencies to do it. Yep.
I wanted to ask about your perspective on social media versus marketing, as a directional type of communication from a brand or an organization to its target audience, whereas social media is a lot more like transparent, immediate value, immediate response from customers.
Yep.
And it's actually a lot more like the roundabout model, where it's like, this
Yep.
explicit conversation. And that kind of thing is also easy for organization versus an agency that has as its client to be real that way and have that be an agile. Word marketing.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
So-
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess agile marketing versus engagement, like we've been talking about. The old school.
Oh, like sort of like ongoing, like social media is like back and forth conversation versus.
If I go look at your Twitter feed and
Yeah.
a bunch of brand organizations and software companies and everybody having conversations, that's very real time. That's very.
I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but what I will say is that social media and community programs in general, I think, are very central to Agile, because Agile thrives on immediate feedback. And so this is why there's an incredible amount of companies are realizing increasingly that they need to build a community around their products and services so that they can feed the agile process and get the feedback that they need. And that often does come from social media or from an owned community or from a third-party community. Yeah.
Also very high profile, which is easier to
Yeah.
sell into the.
Yep. I don't want you to miss your flight.
No, unfortunately, I've got to catch a flight tonight,
Yes.
back to East.
I think we're just about out of time. I'm happy to stay and answer some questions for those that we didn't get, but thank you again for hosting us and for coming out tonight. It was a pleasure.